Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Power to Paint. Today we're going to learn how to do a coyote. I originally was going to make this into one video, but I actually changed my mind about what I was going to do in the background. So I decided to make it into two parts and break it up. One into how to paint the coyote and two in how to do a snowy background. So this is obviously part one. So today we're going to learn how to block in our shapes. It really is like any other painting I do. We're going to block in our shapes, create a local color, build up our shape and form, and then add the detail. So without further ado, why don't we get into the studio and I'll show you how I painted this puppy. So as with any other painting, there's three major steps I like to take when I'm painting something. And it doesn't matter what I'm painting, whether it's fur, whether it's snow, whether it's a sky, whether anything. I do the same process time in and time out when I'm doing a painting. And that is, first I want to block in my local colors and make sure that they're accurate and the values are set correctly. And that's extremely so important to creating a good, well-balanced painting that has flow and gels together. Okay. The second step is then I build up the shape and form. Once I know that my proportions are all right, my blocked in colors I'm happy with, and my values are working well, then I really build up the shape or the form of the object I'm painting, in this case, the coyote. And in the final, and I'd say only about 10% of the painting is that final 10% is detailing. So a lot of the painting depends on your build-up and your ability to structure a painting properly. So here you can see I'm starting to block in my my base or local colors, and what that means is I'm really trying to lay down the color that's the most defined color of that area. So right now I'm doing the top of the head. It's very brown, deep down brown gray. So on the left side of the head, I made those brown grays with warmer colors, and on the right side of the head, I actually used some blues to cool those colors off because we want the head to turn. And this guy, he's in a snowy setting that's highlight from one side and then kind of shadowy on one side. So we have to translate that into paint. And what I mean by translating into paint is you not only have to play with your darks, your lights, but you also have to play with your warms and cools. So I zoomed into the head here, and you can see that the left side has a very warm reddish tinge to it, whereas the right side of the head has a very cool blue side. Okay, so when you're blocking in, not only pay attention to the actual values and the actual hue of the color you're laying, but its temperature too. Now, another thing that I'm really interested in when I'm first laying down my paint, and by the way, I'm laying this, as you can see, this coats down in very thin layers at first. Why? Because I want to make sure my proportions are correct too. I'm not only dealing with the color correctness of my painting, if you will, but I also need to make sure that everything's proportioned right. And proportion is so important. And one of the things I really hear a lot, especially in workshops, is people saying, I can correct that later. No. Now is the time when you're blocking in to correct everything. You correct your color, you correct your proportions, and you correct your shape and form, okay? If you have all those working, then detail is just an added on bonus to your painting in the end. It's not a correcting agent. A lot of people think, well, when I start to detail, I can rearrange things. Well, that's the wrong time to do it. The right time to do it is now when there's not a lot of paint on the board. The paint is very thin, and it's easily correctable, and it's easily painted out. So now, that's not to mean that you can't change your painting as you go on. I mean, there's many paintings, and in fact, in this one, I have painted out areas that I'm not happy with the rendering, and I've moved on. But for the most part, I try to do all of my color correcting, all my proportional correcting, my anatomy correcting in the beginning at this stage when I'm blocking in. So here's a picture of the reference I'm using to paint my coyote. And you can see that there's a strong light source from the left side. So this is late evening, the sun was just setting, and this is actually a coyote that went meandering through my backyard, driving my dog nuts because I wouldn't let him out because I wanted to take photographs. And I actually ventured outside with a camera, and he didn't seem to take off. he didn't seem to mind me there at all. So I snapped off a couple of pictures, and this is what I came up with. So as I'm painting this, I'm keeping in mind that I have a strong light source on the left-hand side, and that I really need to play off my warms and my cools. And I want to get some nice deep saturated colors in here too, but the only way to get good deep saturated colors is to have the opposite, and that's to have some very dulled, cool browns and grays in his coat too, which will make those warms really jump off the board. So you can see here as I'm painting in the back legs, I'm painting in a very cool gray, and that's pushing the leg forward. And now as I paint the foreground legs and this hind leg that has a very strong light source to it, I'm using colors that have more of the siennas in them, because the siennas are very warm. Raw and burnt sienna are really nice warming up colors. So in the browns, I'm putting in a lot more of these siennas on those hindquarters, in the legs, and eventually when I do the tail too, there'll be quite a bit in there. But the only reason why they are looking so warm and so saturated is because I have the cools. It's the same thing as, how many times have you guys ever done a painting and you said, it just doesn't seem to be bright enough? Well, it probably is bright enough, but it's just that you don't have enough darks in there to relate and balance off that warm and cool structure in a painting, or a dark and light structure for that matter in a painting. So if you ever find yourself thinking, man, my painting, it's really dark, it's probably not because it's too dark, you've got all the darks you need in there. It's probably because you lack lights, and vice versa. If you're thinking, wow, this painting is really light, it doesn't seem to have too much depth into it, like it's not getting bright enough and I'm almost to a pure white, it's because you don't have any darks in the painting to counter or contrast those lights. Okay, so contrast in the form of lights and cools and warms and lights and cools and warms and dark, for darks and lights and warms and cools, that's better, is very essential to have that balance and that contrast, so that your painting has depth and has that real deep feel to it. So I'm done the first coat here, and I'm actually very, very happy with what I'm seeing. I got a good play of warms and cools off each other. I got a good play of darks and lights off each other, and I'm very happy with his proportioning. He looks correct to me. And one of the tricks you can do, if you think that you might be out of proportion or a little off in your rendering of something, is take it over to a mirror and look at it backwards, and that'll reveal any kind of out of whack, if you will, things in your painting right away. The other thing I like to do, and you're going to see me do it quite a few times in this video, I think I've already done it once too, is turn my board upside down. Because when you look at an object from an unfamiliar point of view, you're going to see anything that's out of whack. So I like to turn my board upside down quite often while I'm painting, just to make sure that everything is as it should be and it's being rendered correctly. So when I'm starting to build up my shape and form now, I'm going to start with the eyes. Why do I start with the eyes? Well, because about 30 years ago, a wise old man named John C. Lester said to me, if I'm doing an animal, I always start with the eyes. Why? Because if the eyes don't work, none of the rest of the painting will work. And he's so right. The eyes are the gateway to the soul, so we relate to the eyes. And when you learn marketing, you learn that, we'll go to the colors red, we'll go to colors yellow, we'll go to a human over anything else, but we'll also go directly to the eyes. Why? Because we see through the eyes. So we have an unconscious relationship to eyes. So I'll always start with them, and I'll make sure that they're nice and powerful, they're lively, and they're breathing life into the animal before I go on. So I suggest that you guys start with your eyes whenever you're painting an animal too, and just make sure there's all kinds of life in those eyes. So as I keep building up my shape and form, I'm also correcting colors along the way. The first base coats, when they go on, they're giving me what the local color should look like, but when I say it should look like, I mean I'm relating it more to, is it a good value and a good contrast to my other colors laid on the board? Whereas the second coat, where I'm building up the shape and form, I'm really making sure that those values and the hue itself is right on to what it should be. Now, when I want to talk about value a little bit because people so often at workshops, I say, well, that's a little dark or that's a little light for the area compared to the reference. And they'll say, well, I can correct that later. Well, it's just like earlier when I said about detailing and building up your actual proportioning. Now's the time to do that. Don't wait to the end when you have to repaint things. Do it now. So what I'm doing right here is I'm just slightly adjusting colors. When I go around this eye, I'm seeing that there's a lot more blue in the far side, and which is the cool side of it, and I'm seeing a lot more warmth on the left side, which is the sun-drenched side. So I'm correcting that as I paint. Now even my whites, as I paint the muzzle here, they're going to have cools and warms. When I do the underside of the muzzle, there's a lot of blues in the mixture. When I do the side of the muzzle, I'm adding in a lot of, not a lot of, but actually a touch of raw sienna, or depending on where it is in the muzzle, a little bit of cadmium yellow light. So I'm warming colors and I'm cooling colors, and the relationship between the darks, the lights, and the warms and cools are just as important. Okay. So at this point, I'm starting to soften or transist my colors. And what I mean by that is I'm taking the laid colors and I'm creating a mixture that's about halfway between each and applying it between the two colors, which softens off the transition from one color to the next. And when I lay this down, though, I'm not just randomly throwing the paint down on the board. I'm actually laying the paint down on the board now with the direction or the flow of the fur, the lay of the fur in mind. Okay, so when I'm blending these together, I'm also keeping in mind, yes, the fur is falling left to right here, the fur is falling top to bottom here. I'm following my reference and laying down my transition colors in the direction of the fur. So I start to create that depth in the fur, that direction of the fur, and the form of the coyote by doing that. Now keep in mind, when I say that I'm laying down the strokes in the direction of the fur, I am by no means doing any kind of detail. I am just very cognizant right now when I'm painting of what the direction of the fur is, and that's going to help build up my shape and form. Detail will become much later. I really need to build up my shape and my form and have great, fantastic color and structure before I can even think about putting any kind of detail down. Layering, layering, layering. That's all I'm thinking about in the painting right now, is building up that layer after layer after layer that really is what creates the depth in our painting. See my hands flailing all over the place there? Well, that was me dictating on the video how you need to build up your layers before you can move on to doing your details. You really need some depth in your fur by doing the transition strokes and laying down your local colors before you can get into that detailed part. Oh, there you go. There's me turning the board upside down. What was I doing there? I was checking my proportions, making sure everything is looking good. Turn the board upside down, turn it sideways if you want, turning it upside down. It makes me look at the painting from an unfamiliar point of view. So anything that is not right will stand out like a sore thumb. It's just the same thing as putting it in front of a mirror. Anything that is not proportionally correct or is painted out of whack, if you will stick out like a sore thumb. So just get into the habit of turning your painting upside down and taking a look, quick look, nothing fancy, quick 1 second look. Anything that's out of whack, it'll stand out like a sore thumb. So in the real-time video here, I'm going off about how you need to have little shots of cools, even on your warm side. And I was demonstrating by using the gray-brown of the head. There was some gray-brown on just the lower part of the muzzle there. So what I did to warm up the gray-brown was I put a touch of that yellow color into the mixture, just to warm it up. Which brings me to the point of, don't have pure cools on the cool side of your face. So let's use the coyote's head here as an example. So as we said a couple of times already, right side of his head's in shadow, so it's cooler. left side of his face, it's hitting sunlight, it's warmer, right? Well, even in the warm left-hand side, I have little shots of cool colors by adding blues in, adding deeper browns in, cooler browns, that are right beside the warms. And what does that do? It accentuates the warms. Because it has that contrast of a cooler color right beside it, it makes the warms look warmer. If you didn't have those little shots of cools in the warms, the whole side of the face would just look saturated and warm and really have no depth. It would have no real structure inside the fur, and vice versa. On the right hand of the side of the face, there's lots of blues, but I have little shots of some burnt siennas, the rusty color here and there, to warm up that side. And by placing those warms beside the predominant blues on that side of the face, it really makes that side of the face look cool because it has a warm to contrast against, which brings me right back to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago in the video. You have to have a good balance, not only in your darks, your lights, which are your values, but you also have to have a good balance between the warms and cools, the color temperature of your paints. If everything is made with purely cool colors, you will have a very flat, boring, cold feeling piece, and vice versa. If you have nothing but warms because you're really trying to get that bright orange and yellow in the Coyote, so you put so much orange and yellow everywhere in the Coyote, it'll look flat again because there's no cool to contrast to make that warm look warm, and vice versa. There'll be no cools because there's no warms, okay? So you have to have that balance between warms and cools. Painting is a constant thinking process. When I'm at my board, I am thinking every single second I'm painting. And I can remember some good advice from Carl Brenders. He says the best paintings are those that are made with the fewest strokes. And what he meant by that was think about every stroke. If you're aware or familiar with Carl Brenders, you're probably thinking, Carl said that? He's Mr. Detail. I mean, the man paints thousands and thousands of hair. But what he meant by that is every single hair he painted had purpose. It wasn't just laid down as filler. If he wanted to create a really warm side, he'd contrast it with a cool side. If he wanted something to be cool, he'd contrast it with a little bit of warm. Okay, so keep that in mind. So here I'm saying that there's enough structure and build up in the head that we can move on to the body. So I've put, I guess you could say it's an initiating detail in the head to the point of I've laid down my transition colors in my directions of the fur and in a style that's creating the impression of a fur by the way I've overlapped them, but I'm by no means putting any kind of stroked detail down. So with the head fairly well detailed up, I'm good with the structure, I can move on to the body. And the body has a lot of different plays in it. The body is going to be a lot more work in terms of thinking, because I really have to play the warms and cools off in a subtle manner in the body. The head was pretty easy because the head had a cool side, a warm side. So that's pretty easy to paint. But when you're getting into the body now that has very subtle changes where the light is, because it's that late day light, it's not a hard, intense light, it's more of a soft light that it's very warm where it's hitting and cools off quite quickly because it's not a heavily intense light, but it gives off a real distinct warm area, or I wouldn't say distinct, but a very easy to see warm area, but quite quickly falls off into the cools. So now we have to get a little more particular on how we're laying our colors in our bodies, and we've got to play the warms and cools off a little more subtly. So I take a lot more time in the body building up the shape and form because I really want to make sure I'm getting that play of warms and cools down, as well as putting in my darks and lights. Right here you can see me putting in my darks. These are going to be strokes indicating where there's going to be those indentations in the fur, where, you know, when you look at the side of any kind of canine, they have little flows in their fur and little indentations and little inconsistencies. It's not just flat right across the side. It's got little ups and downs and little waves, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm just putting in a couple little dark areas that are going to tell me where the deep indentations are, so that on the next stage, just like the head, when I start laying down my directional strokes, I know where I should have strokes falling into the fur and raising out of the fur. Now, just like we use those darks to create little indentations and inconsistencies in the fur, I can also use my warms to build up heights in the fur. Now, the hind part of this rear leg, it's catching a lot of sunlight, so I need to have a lot of warms. And by placing heavy warms on one side, and then the cools that I'm mixing now on back sides of the legs, I create turning in the leg, I create a back, I create a side, I create a hind side. Okay, so think about that in terms of planes. Whenever I'm teaching a workshop, I explain this in terms of planes. So you have a square. A square has, or I'm sorry, not a square, but a cube has 6 sides. Well, how do I tell people that that cube's going to have different size? Well, the first thing I can do is in value. I can create different shades of value on each side that tells the viewer, hey, something's changed. In a painting, not only do we use value, we use the hue of a color. Hue actually means color, and we also use the values, and we use the intensity of the color. The intensity of the color usually relates to the warm, the cool value or properties of that color. So choosing one of these 3, I can push and pull them, and that helps me tell the viewer, this is where one side is, this is where another side is, and this is where another side is. So we'll use the hind leg as an example. We'll just go over that again. By painting the yellows on the left side of the leg, I tell it this part of the leg is facing the left side, which is the light source side of the painting. By then using the neutraled out colors of the side of the leg, I'm telling the viewer that's a side, that's a different plane. And then by using the blues on the back side of the leg, we tell the viewer it's once again turned, and now it's facing to the right. Okay, so we're using colors, and we're using values, and we're using tonal aspects to make all these changes in our fur. And if there's a change in the fur in the reference, there has to be a change in the painting mixture to translate that change onto the board. What you're doing is you're trying to convince people that you have a 3D element on a 2D board. And these are the little tricks we use to pull that off. So I'm really happy with my shape, my form, my structure here. I got a great sense of where the leg starts, where the tail starts, where the back starts, where the side starts, where the raised paw starts, what have you. I'm really very confident that I have a good, balanced, well-structured, well-proportioned coyote here. And now I can start breaking up the area, which is the first step in detailing. Yay, we're finally there, huh? And I actually like to use a Prismacolor and draw in my directional breakups before I lay them in. Why? Well, first of all, when I lay down with a Prismacolor, it's so easy to remove with a pencil. I can get rid of it in 2 seconds. And 2, I can see my directional lines and make sure that I'm flowing properly and I'm proportionate before I actually go in with a brush. Sometimes I get that Superman complex and I just go right to the board and hope for the best. It usually works out, but that odd time it doesn't. So more often than not, I'm going to draw in my directional lines before I start painting them in. And all I'm doing here is I'm breaking these large areas up and I'm creating the pattern in the fur. Just like earlier when we talked about the darker color, putting in where the little dips and doodles of the fur is, that's exactly what I'm doing here with darker colors and then highlighting with lighter or warmer colors, if you will, depending on where we are on the board and what the instance is. So zooming in here, you can see it a little better. I start by breaking up with the darks, and then I start laying in highlights beside those darks, and those are what will really start building up some depth in the fur. And the key to getting really good depth in fur is having those breakups and those variances between warms and cools and warms and darks, lights and darks. You really have to have those dark areas where the fur is receding in a little bit, and then you need those light areas to say, hey, this is sticking out. Now, more of the light strokes come when I'm putting in finer hairs, and that's for sure, because usually the finer hairs, they're the ones that are catching a lot more light than the structural, what I call the structural hairs. Those fine little hairs that we paint in, they're what I call the hero hairs. You know, in a movie, they have a stunt. Let's take Star Wars, for instance. They'll have a stunt lightsaber that they use for general filming, but then they'll have a beautiful primo lightsaber for those close-up shots of it. Well, that's how I kind of explain painting, that your darker ones are, your darker strokes are kind of painting in those dips and cracks in the fur, so you're creating a nice structure. But your light strokes are usually highlighting the actual detailed and finesse hairs on the Coyote, because they're catching a lot more light than the base fur, so they're really more of a highlight stroke, and they're what I call my hero strokes. So that's what I'm doing right here in my painting. I'm going back and forth between my darks to create dips and cracks in the fur, and I'm using my highlights to bring out forward edges and those hero strokes to bring out the real look of the fur. So here's a good example. You see when I'm laying in these these strong yellows, how they're more of a distinct fur. They're what I call my hero strokes, because they are creating absolute hair strokes. They're not just there for structure, for form. They're there to create detail. And usually the darker strokes, they're just helping to create the shape and form. Where is the fur dipping in, and where is it getting a little depth into it, so I get a little darker. The lighter strokes, they're creating those, hello, I'm a hair stroke. Okay? So now I detail the back side of the leg. Well, I add in blues into the mixture, a lot of titanium whites and some cobalt blues, because the back side of the leg is in shadow, but it still has just as much detail as the lit side. I see a lot of people that they forget about their shadows and they leave them almost black, or they leave them lackluster. They don't put any kind of detail into them, and that's a big mistake. When you're looking, the human eye can see so much variances in tone. It's really very incredible when you think about it. So you need to paint that into your paintings too. Don't forget about your shadows. Put just as much detail on your shadowed sides as you do in your highlighted sides. So as you can see, as I paint the tail here, on the right hand side, I've got a lot of deep dark colors and blue strokes. And as I get to the left hand side, I've got a lot of rusty color strokes and a lot of warm yellow strokes. Okay, so I'm really building up my shape and my form through the use of color, through the warmth of color, and through the tone of that color. So here in the final stages of the painting, there's a lot of back and forth. I'm going back and forth between my very dark, intense, deep colors and my very bright, saturated colors. And I'm really refining where I'm using cools, where I'm using warms, so that I create a real sense of depth. This is just not laying down hair for the sake of laying down hair. Just like I said earlier, every stroke has a purpose. I'm also not forgetting to put little shots of warms on my cool sides and vice versa. You can see the yellows down the side of the cool side of the tail. Yes, they're yellow, but they've been tinted with a little bit of cool blue, so they have a little bit of a yellowish look. You can see that was it in the dish here, and I'm applying some of it to the top. So I do have shots of warms going through my cools, but they're not pure warms like they are on the sun-drenched side. They're a muted down warm, but you still want to have those warms in your cool sides. And like right here on the back, I also want cools in my warming up areas. I'm laying in a lot of lighter color here, and in 2 seconds you're going to see me go back in with darks and create more of a hair, refined hair, because the back of a coyote, he's got kind of a broken up patchy coat. I call it the coat of many colors, you know, the old Dolly Parton coat of many colors. That's exactly what a coyote's got. The color changes in his coat are so vast and continuous that it's continuously changing. They might have small patches of color, but they very quickly turn into a different color within inches of each other. So here on now, I'm putting in some of the lighter highlight colors, and then in a second I'll go back in and I'll put in some of the darker colors. Okay, so I'm bleeding in the yellows here into the backs. And one of the points I actually forgot to mention when I was painting the back a couple of seconds ago is that the back is reflecting a lot of light from the sky, which is blue. But our background's blue, right? So we've been using cobalt blue on our right-hand side of our elements to say, hey, yeah, this is turning away. It's turning to the cool side. It's not getting any direct sunlight. So what do we do when we get to the top? If we use cobalt blue again, we're going to say to the viewer that it's the same as the side on the right-hand side, but it's not. So what I do is I use an ultramarine blue in the mixture for the top of the back here. So if you take a good look, you can see that the right side of the leg, the hind leg, it has a very bluish tinge, you know, a cool blue tinge, whereas the top, the blue, has more of a violety look to it, and that's because I used ultramarine red shade that has a little bit of a warmer tone to it. Okay, so if you're not if, but when you need to use blues on more than one plane, make sure you vary up those tones. Okay, now here's another great example of what I was talking about earlier, how traditionally for me the warmer strokes are the hero strokes. You see, by laying down these brighter, warmer strokes, they become very distinct hair strokes, and now they really create that furry texture, that furry pattern on the coats. And I just continue to break it up in both warms and cools. So as I'm finishing up the final little strokes in the coyote here, we're coming to the end of part 1, and we'll move on to the snow in part 2. You'll notice that I haven't done a lot on the legs, and that's because I'm going to do so much brush work with the snow behind him that it's just easier for me to leave the legs, do all the detailing that's behind them, and then finish the legs up, and then I don't have to worry about edges and cleaning them out later, and it's just an easier way to go. So there's the basic part of the coyote, and I'm actually extremely very, very, very happy with my coyote. The only thing I'm a little bit, I wouldn't say disappointed, but unhappy, and trust me, I'm always unhappy with certain elements of every painting I paint, is his tail. I'm not convinced that it's rendered well enough. I'll let it sit and you know, fester on me for a little while, for lack of a better word, and then I'll decide if I want to go on or leave it or rework it. So there's our finished coyote for now. We're going to move on into part 2, and I'll have that up for you in a couple of days. And then in part 2, the ending will be how I can finish up the legs and clean up the edges with the coyote. So there you have it. There's part number 1. We'll move on to part number 2. So please feel free to like it, share it, subscribe to it, and click the little bell, and that'll let you know whenever there's a new video out on my channel. So until the next video, everybody stay safe, be good to each other, and happy painting.